Before we begin, I want to take a moment to honor the cultures behind the stories we are about to explore. The tales shared here come from many peoples, lands, and traditions. I do not change these stories to fit modern expectations or to align with today's social standards. Instead, I present them as they were told, sometimes beautiful, sometimes harsh, sometimes challenging. We are not here to judge the past, but to understand it, to listen, to learn, and to honor the ancestors who carried these stories forward. We also share stories from various religious traditions. These are presented in their historical and spiritual context, with respect for their beliefs that they represent. Every culture deserves respect, context, and acknowledgement, and this space is dedicated to doing exactly that. August 19th, The Forge. Story 1, Hephaestus and the Forge Beneath the Fire. Among the immortals of Olympus, beauty and perfection were expected almost as naturally as divinity itself, which made Hephaestus unusual from the beginning. The god of fire, metalworking, craftsmanship, and the forge was remembered as physically different from the other gods, described in ancient poetry as lame. Yet his hands could create things that even the most powerful Olympians could not make for themselves. Greek traditions disagreed about how his fall from Olympus occurred. In one famous account preserved in Homer's Iliad, Hephaestus remembered being hurled from heaven by Zeus after attempting to defend his mother Hera during a quarrel. He fell for an entire day before landing upon the island of Lemnos, where the Sintian people cared for him. Another tradition said Hera herself cast him away because she was ashamed of her newborn son's disability, after which the sea goddesses, Thetis and Eurynome, sheltered him beneath the ocean. There, hidden inside a cavern surrounded by the roar of the sea, Hephaestus discovered what would become his defining power. For 9 years he worked in secrecy, fashioning brooches, necklaces, cups, chains, and intricate ornaments, while the world above scarcely knew where he had gone. The rejected god became a master craftsman. When Hephaestus eventually returned to the divine world, he did not return empty-handed. His forge became the birthplace of wonders. He fashioned magnificent palaces for the Olympians, created divine armor, constructed golden attendants capable of moving and assisting him, and made objects so extraordinary that craftsmanship itself seemed almost alive beneath his hands. One of his greatest creations appears in the Iliad when Thetis comes to him desperate for armor for her son Achilles. Hephaestus remembers the kindness she once showed him and immediately enters his forge. Great bellows roar to life. Bronze, tin, gold, and silver enter the furnace. With hammer and tongs he works the glowing metal, creating a helmet, breastplate, greaves, and finally the magnificent shield of Achilles, upon which he forms an entire vision of existence. Earth and sea, sun and moon, cities at peace and war, fields being plowed, vineyards being harvested, dancers moving, cattle wandering, and the great river ocean encircling everything. The god once thrown from heaven becomes the one capable of placing a world upon a shield. Greek myth never requires Hephaestus to become physically identical to the other Olympians before recognizing his power. Ancient artists could portray him with the tools of his craft, and poets repeatedly emphasized the extraordinary intelligence and skill contained within the body others had once rejected. His forge, therefore, became more than a room filled with flame. It was the place where raw substances became objects worthy of gods, where heat made metal workable, where hammer blows gave it form, and where Hephaestus himself transformed exclusion into mastery. Fire did not erase the history of the gods standing before it. It gave his hands somewhere to build. Story 2, The Dwarves Who Forged the Gods' Greatest Treasures. Deep within the world of Norse myth, where mountains concealed passages and stones seemed capable of keeping secrets, lived craftsmen whose skill could produce things even the gods could not create for themselves. The Dvergar, the beings usually called dwarves in English. One of the greatest tales of their craft begins, strangely enough, with a cruel joke. The trickster Loki cut away the beautiful golden hair of Sif, wife of the thunder god Thor, and when Thor discovered what had happened, Loki was forced to make amends. He traveled to the sons of Ivaldi, master craftsmen who entered their forge and produced 3 astonishing treasures. New hair for Seth, made from real gold that would grow upon her head like natural hair. Skeith Blathnir, a magnificent ship for the god Freyr that could always find favorable wind and could be folded small enough to carry when it was not sailing. And Gungnir, the spear destined for Odin, perfectly made and deadly in the god's hand. 3 wonders should have been enough to satisfy anyone, but Loki could never resist turning a situation into a wager. He approached 2 more dwarven craftsmen, the brothers, Brokkr and Atri, called Sindri in some manuscripts, and declared that they could never produce 3 objects equal to those made by the sons of Ivaldi. Loki even wagered his own head upon it. The brothers accepted. Atri placed a pigskin into the furnace and ordered Brokkr to work the bellows without stopping until he returned. Loki, realizing what he had risked, transformed himself into a fly and bit Brokkr's arm, but the dwarf continued pumping. From the furnace emerged a golden boar named Gulinbursti, whose radiant bristles shone through darkness and who could run across land, sea, and sky. Atri returned to the forge, placed gold into the fire, and again commanded Brokkr never to stop the bellows. Loki bit him harder, this time upon the neck, but Brokkr endured, and from the forge came Gropnir, Odin's golden ring, from which 8 rings of equal weight would drop every 9th night. For the final creation, Atri placed iron into the furnace. Loki now understood that he was dangerously close to losing his wager. As Brokkr worked the bellows, the fly attacked his eyelids so viciously that blood ran into his eye. For only an instant, Brokkr released the bellows to wipe the blood away. When Atri returned, he knew the interruption had affected their work. Yet from the furnace came Mjolnir, the hammer of Thor, capable of striking with tremendous force, never missing when thrown, and returning to its wielder's hand. Its handle was shorter than intended because the bellows had stopped too soon. But when the gods gathered to judge the treasures, Mjolnir was declared the greatest of them, all because it could protect gods and humans against the giants. Loki had tried 3 times to interrupt the forge, and 3 times something extraordinary emerged from it. Even the final piece, marked forever by the moment the work faltered, became Thor's greatest weapon. The dwarves had taken hide, gold, and iron into the heat and returned with the treasures fit for gods, proving that within the Norse imagination, the forge was a place where skill, patience, flame, and relentless pressure could make the impossible solid enough to hold. Story 3. Amakuni and the Birth of the Curved Japanese Sword. In one of Japan's most enduring legends of the swordsmith, a craftsman named Amakuni Yasodtsuna served as the head swordsmith to the emperor, working beside his son, Amakura, in a forge where iron, charcoal, water, and human skill met beneath the hammer. Each day, warriors passed their workshop carrying the blades Amakuni had made, and the smith took enormous pride in watching his work leave for battle. But according to the legend, one day the warriors returned and something was wrong. Many of their swords were broken. Amakuni watched them pass and noticed that the emperor did not offer him the customary greeting. For a craftsman whose reputation lived inside every blade he created, the silence cut deeply. He examined the damaged weapons and saw that they had failed under the violence of battle. Instead of blaming the warriors or accepting that swords simply broke, Amakuni gathered the shattered blades and returned to his forge. He, Namakura, examined how they had fractured, studying the weaknesses revealed only after the steel had endured tremendous force. Then they began again. Tradition says the 2 smiths secluded themselves and prayed to the Shinto deities for 7 days and 7 nights before returning to their work with a new purpose. They would create a blade capable of surviving what had destroyed the others. They selected iron-bearing material, heated it within the charcoal fire, hammered it, shaped it, and repeatedly worked the metal beneath controlled heat. The legend compresses into one dramatic invention techniques that Japanese smiths would refine across generations. But its central image is unmistakable. Failure returned to the forge as knowledge. Omakuni eventually produced a new sword with a single cutting edge in a curved form, an ancestor in legend of the blades for which Japan would later become famous. The real history of the Japanese sword developed gradually rather than through one miraculous invention, and later smiths perfected extraordinarily sophisticated methods of working tamahagani, steel produced in the traditional tatara furnace. A smith could repeatedly heat, hammer, fold, and weld selected pieces of steel, distributing carbon and removing impurities while constructing the material from which the blade would emerge. One of the most remarkable stages came near the end. The sword was cooled with a carefully arranged clay mixture, generally thinner along the cutting edge and thicker across the other portions, heated again and then quenched in water. Because different parts cooled differently, the edge became exceptionally hard while the body retained greater resilience, and the process helped create the visible temper pattern known as a haman. Fire made the steel workable. Hammering changed its structure. Water hardened it, and the smith's judgment governed every transition between them. In the legend, Omakuni eventually saw warriors returning carrying his new blades intact. Years passed, battles came and went, and his swords endured. Whether or not one historical man invented the curved Japanese sword matters less to the legend than what Omakuni came to represent. The smith, who looked directly at broken work, carried it back into the heat, and learned enough from its fractures to forge differently the next time. Story 4. When the furnace became alive. In northern Togo, where generations of ironworkers transformed stone from the earth into metal, the Basar region became one of West Africa's great centers of iron production, with an iron working history stretching back more than 2,000 years. Archaeologists have uncovered mines, furnaces, slag heaps, smithing areas, stone anvils, an entire landscape shaped by people who understood how to extract ore, prepare charcoal, control extraordinary temperatures, separate usable iron from slag, and eventually forge that iron into tools and objects that moved through regional trade networks. Yet, among Basari ironworkers, making iron was never merely a matter of throwing ore into a hot furnace and waiting for metal to emerge. Knowledge surrounded every stage, and the furnace itself could be understood as something astonishingly alive. When researchers worked with Basari elders and ironworkers during a reconstruction of traditional smelting in the 20th century, they documented a ritual language in which the smelter became the husband of the furnace, while the furnace was understood through the body of a woman capable of bringing forth iron. Its upper portion was spoken of as a head, its center became a stomach, its interior was a belly that had to be filled with ore and charcoal. Other parts were understood as a chest and lungs, and as air entered the structure and the charcoal began to burn fiercely, the furnace began, in ritual language, to breathe. Even before the smelting began, preparation carried meaning. The furnace was constructed deliberately from the ground upward, and ritual actions accompanied the process. Light beer could be poured upon the earth as an offering acknowledging the ancestors, while medicinal plants marked the furnace area. The furnace's stomach could receive a ceremonial meal or mudfish before its deeper belly received the substances that would become iron. Then came the transformation itself. Charcoal fed the fire, while carefully controlled air intensified the heat. Ore that had existed within the landscape entered a human-built chamber and encountered temperatures powerful enough to separate metal from the surrounding material. What eventually emerged was not yet a polished knife, hoe, spear, or tool. The iron bloom still contained slag and impurities and had to undergo further work, including crushing, refining, reheating, and forging before a smith could shape it into something useful. Archaeological evidence from Basar even preserves stone surfaces used in parts of this process, showing how deeply specialized ironworking became within the region. Generation after generation learned that successful iron demanded more than strength. A smelter needed knowledge of ore, clay, charcoal, airflow, furnace construction, temperature, timing, ritual obligation, and the inherited practices surrounding the craft. By the larger Iron Age, Basar iron production had expanded dramatically, feeding regional networks and leaving enormous traces across the landscape. Yet perhaps the most remarkable surviving image is still the furnace itself, built from earth, filled, fed, heated until its interior glowed, and understood through the language of a living body. The iron did not simply appear. The furnace labored over it. Earth entered as ore, endured charcoal and tremendous heat, emerged as a rough bloom, and still required repeated human effort before becoming something strong enough to use. In the Basar forge, transformation was never instantaneous. It was a process, and fire was only the beginning. Daily thread for August 19th. What am I becoming? There is a difference between being burned and being forged. Both involve heat. Both can leave marks. Both can change what existed before. But the forge introduces something new to our journey through fire. Direction. Yesterday, we asked what healing means and discovered that restoration does not always require becoming who we were before. Today, we take whatever has survived, healed, or newly emerged and place it upon the anvil. The question is no longer simply, what happened to me? It becomes, what am I becoming because I am willing to work with what remains? Hephaestus knew the forge as both workplace and source of extraordinary creation. Greek tradition remembered a god whose body distinguished him from the other Olympians, and whose craftsmanship distinguished him even further. The hands of the god once thrown from Olympus eventually created palaces, armor, golden attendants, and the magnificent shield of Achilles. His power did not require erasing his history. He created from where he stood. In the Norse world, the dwarven smiths took materials that seemed ordinary beside the grandeur of the gods and produced treasures even gods could not make for themselves. Rocker continued pumping the bellows while Loki attacked him again and again. When one interruption finally affected the work, the resulting hammer emerged with a shortened handle. It was imperfect according to the original design, yet Mjolnir still became the greatest treasure of the contest. The Japanese legend of Amakuni carries us deeper into the forge because his transformation begins with failure. His swords returned broken. Rather than hiding the fractures, he studied them. The broken blades showed him where his work had failed, and the legend remembers him returning to the fire with that knowledge. Japanese sword making would become an extraordinary art of controlled transformation. Steel heated, hammered, folded, shaped, hardened, and polished until what entered the forge could scarcely be compared with what emerged. And among the Basari ironworkers of Togo, even the furnace itself could be understood as alive. Ore entered its belly alongside charcoal. Air fed its tremendous heat. A rough iron bloom emerged, but even then the work was unfinished. The metal still needed refining, reheating, hammering, and shaping before it could become something useful. That may be the most important thing today's forge teaches us. Transformation is not one dramatic moment. We often expect becoming to arrive as revelation. One morning we will wake completely confident, completely healed, completely disciplined, completely certain of who we are. But metal does not enter the furnace as ore and leap out as a finished sword. There are stages. Heat makes it workable. Hammering gives it shape. Cooling preserves what has been formed. Sometimes it returns to the fire because the work is not finished. Sometimes a fracture reveals something the smith could not see before. And none of that means the metal has failed. It means it is still becoming. Perhaps pressure works similarly within us. Some pressure can destroy, and there is no wisdom in pretending every hardship was necessary or deserved. But there are also pressures we deliberately accept because they shape us towards something we have chosen. Practicing when we would rather quit. Learning when we would rather already know. Creating after something failed. Keeping a promise to ourselves. Setting a boundary. Trying again. Admitting we were wrong, or remaining beside the work long enough to become skilled at it. Those are hammer blows we participate in. So today, do not ask only whether life has been hard. Ask something more useful. What is all this work shaping? Look at the person who exists now compared with the person who first entered this journey. What has strengthened? What has sharpened? What has become more flexible? What if your failures taught you to make differently? And where are you still unfinished? You do not need to answer that last question with shame. The unfinished blade is not worthless metal. It is simply still in the forge. Maybe that is where you are too. Not ruined, not late, not required to have your final shape already figured out. Heated enough to change, strong enough to endure the work, and increasingly capable of participating in your own creation. You are not required to emerge from every fire finished. Sometimes the greatest realization is simply this: I can finally see what I am becoming.